Conceive, believe, achieve.
This is former UFC middleweight champion of the world, Michael Bisping.
Paddy the Baddy here. You're listening to Combat Sports UK.
And you're watching Combat Sports UK.
Hello everybody and welcome to Combat Sports UK. You may have noticed that there's a change in personnel, and that's because we are not discussing the same sport. We have just released our debut episode for the MMA, and we're now going to do a boxing podcast. So today I have got Jared Miller with me. Jay, how you doing, mate?
I'm all good here, mate. How are you doing, Nathan?
Not too bad, mate. Not too bad. Getting regular with this podcast thing now.
Yeah.
Twice in 1 week.
Now, isn't it?
Yeah, we're getting into the flow. So obviously we did the podcast, which is now out across YouTube, Spotify and Apple Play. If you're not following our social medias already, then you should jump onto Facebook, Twitter and Instagram for Combat Sports UK. You can also, obviously, you follow the articles and whatnot that you see on there. You'll see Jared, myself and a few others that are contributing to some articles along the way. The last MMA podcast that we did was very well structured. We had Taylor Collard on here, who was the ultimate professional. I'm going to be leading the way on this podcast, so it's expected to be extremely disjointed, a bit here, there, and everywhere, kind of like the world of boxing.
Yeah,
so
100%. I'm sure you do. I'm sure you do a fine job, mate. I wouldn't keep. I wouldn't feel the pressure from Taylor. Don't worry.
No. So the world of boxing, I'm not going to lie, has got me a little bit down in the dumps, a little bit pissed off, a little bit frustrated with it. So before we go into the negatives, we'll kind of start with the positives, because the year itself, we're midway through September now. What's your thoughts, Jay, on the state of boxing this year and some of the fights that we've been given?
Well, I think last year was such a disappointment, especially in terms of men's boxing. I thought the female side, as we'll get on to a bit later with Amanda Serrano, was brilliant. I think it was its breakout year in terms of the mainstream media, and I think the majority of my favourite fights from last year came from the women's side of the game. So from a men's point of view, this year's been certainly a lot better. Had Inouye versus Fulton, had Crawford versus Ennis. So we Errol Spence, sorry, not Ennis.
Spence.
So we So yeah, definitely a much better year this time round. And I'm hoping that we'll see one or two more big fights before the end of the year as well.
Yeah, I mean, I've actually got a list here, so I'm going to actually read it directly off my phone rather than, pretending that I've got them all up in the top of my head. But we're just looking through some of the fights that we've had this year and what we've got coming up for the remainder of the year. So when people talk about boxing being in a bad place, these are some of the fights, especially from a British perspective, some of them that we've had so far this year. We've had Liam Smith, Chris Eubank Jr., Mauricio Lara and Lee Wood, Benavidez and Plant, Ramirez and Comey, Zhang and Choice, Cordina and Rakimov. We had Tank, obviously, against Garcia. We've had Katie Taylor and Chantel Cameron, Devin Haney and Lomachenko, Wood Lara 2, Lopez and Conlon, Lopez against Taylor. We had Inouye and Fulton, as you said, Spence and Crawford, Navarrete and Valdez, and most recently, Liam Smith and Chris Eubank Jr. in the rematch. Now, if we look into the remainder of the year fights that are already booked, we've got Joe Joyce coming up against Zhang again in the rematch there. We've got Canelo and Charlo. We've got Lee Wood against Josh Warrington. We've got Ramirez against Joe Smith Jr., which should be a belter. We've got Josh Buatsi and Dan Aziz. We've got the Chantel Cameron, Katie Taylor rematch. And we've got Bam Rodriguez and Sonny Edwards. So as a whole, boxing's in a pretty good place in regards to, fights that we've had and fights that we've got coming up. The issue with boxing from the outside perspective is that most people judge boxing on the heavyweight division. So we're going to start talking first about Tyson Fury. Obviously, Tyson's the current WBC champ. He holds the lineal heavyweight champion title, as much as he likes to flaunt that around. And he's now fighting Francis Ngannou. Now, you and I both follow the sport of MMA, so jump in and give me your quick thoughts on that fight, first of all.
Yeah, I think from Tyson Fury's point of view, what I guess in defense of him, not that I want to defend him too much for the decision of this fight, but if he's at a point in his career now where he wants to focus on getting the mainstream media behind him. We've seen with At Home with the Furies on Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
If he wants to chase the money fights, then so be it. But don't keep claiming you're the best heavyweight of all time and relinquish your WBC title, because there's top contenders waiting to fight, and we're just not seeing Fury ever go for the undisputed or defend it against. I know people like Dillian White are ranked, but against any of those top contenders across any of the different promotions and the heavyweight division, really.
Yep. I mean, obviously, I put out an article, I think, last week, which is there on the Combat Sports UK website, talking about Tyson Fury and the fact that he's no longer interested in anything other than money fights, he says. And we've always got to take what Tyson says with a pinch of salt, because he's retired 45 times already so far in his career. He's made more fights than he's actually had. He's agreed to terms for everything from his side. He's just been waiting on everybody else, as we've led to believe.
And Frank Warren's side as well.
And Frank Warren
Fury's
as well,
side.
yeah, that's it. So for Tyson Fury to be considered the greatest heavyweight of this generation, which some may already say that he is, because skill for skill, he might just be. But you look at the heavyweight division now and the people that Tyson Fury hasn't faced. Who do you think he needs to face before he rides off into the sunset to kind of cement that legacy?
Well, I think the one that's on everybody's lips is the Usyk undisputed fight. I think we've only had one heavyweight undisputed fight this side of the century, millennia, if you like, and I can't, for the love of me, apart from the politics, decide, figure out why this fight isn't going ahead or hasn't gone ahead so far. That's the main one. From a British point of view, obviously, we all want to see the AJ fight as well, even despite those AJ losses. And I thought, again, from a British, maybe being a bit selfish point of view, that I thought Dubois did a brilliant job against Usyk, and that's another ranked fighter who you may see, is he a top contender at the minute? Maybe. Is he, but maybe not the exact level. I'm looking at people like even people ranked in like the top 4 or 5, like Andy Ruiz Jr., who he's just not tested himself against. And that's not me saying he wouldn't beat him. I think he comfortably beats him. I think he, from an AJ fan's point of view, I think he beats AJ, and I think he might even beat Usyk. And this is the problem we've got.
I think you've absolutely nailed it there, mate. I think when we talk about Tyson Fury, I think skill for skill, everybody can see that he's a fantastic heavyweight. And I'll be honest, back in the day, when he was having fights and getting knocked down by cruiserweights, Steve Cunningham, those kind of days, I was not a big fan of Tyson Fury. And I said when Anthony Joshua came on the scene that Joshua was smashing to bits. That was my genuine belief. And then as the careers have kind of gone on, you've seen flaws in Joshua, and Fury's really stepped up, and it kind of leads me down the same path. If I was going to pick at the moment, I would choose Fury to beat Usyk. I would choose him to beat Joshua. The problem is the evidence isn't there for us. We've not seen them.
No.
If we look at Tyson Fury, people say about the Deontay Wilder trilogy and how great it was, and it was. But let's be honest, Tyson Fury was robbed in that first fight. He won that. The second fight, he categorically won it. The third fight, he was fighting someone he'd just beaten twice. So, and Deontay Wilder has always been considered as probably the heaviest hitting heavyweight of maybe this current era, at least.
At least.
Maybe this generation. When we're talking about one single shot knockout power, Deontay Wilder's definitely got it. But people have always talked about how limited Deontay Wilder is as a boxer. So it's a little difficult to judge Tyson Fury as being the greatest heavyweight of all time, as he's referred to himself as in the past, when we don't have that much to really judge it on.
No, well, you talk about the Wilder trilogy there. I mean, he's 34 years old, and he's had 2 trilogy fights already against people, as you've just mentioned there, he's beaten twice. I know he drew the first fight against Wilder, but then again, I think the argument against that from his point of view will be, if we didn't have the trilogy fight, we wouldn't have got the third Fury Wilder fight, which in my opinion was the best out of the 3. Yeah. I know Fury won that again, but in my opinion, that's one of the best heavyweight title fights I've seen in recent years. So that's the counter argument from their side, I guess. But as I said, no, you're not proving yourself. You're not proving yourself as the best heavyweight of all time fighting these kind of guys.
No, and when we talk about Tyson Fury's resume and we look at the names that are on there, you would argue that potentially not even potentially, as far as I'm concerned, Tyson Fury's best win dates way back to beating Vladimir Klitschko.
Yeah.
And if we actually looked at the performance, it was a one-sided fight for me. I thought Fury won it quite comfortably, but I also think that Vlad never turned up. And then we've got failed drug tests in there, and we've got, stepping away from the sport and the rematch never happening with Klitschko and why that didn't happen. And then, you've got Joshua coming through and then doing what he did to Klitschko, admittedly, an older Klitschko. But for me, there was a poll on Twitter the other day and it was asking what was more impressive, Fury's performance against Klitschko in Germany or Joshua's. For you?
Oh, Joshua's.
Joshua?
100%.
Because the argument would be that obviously Tyson Fury faced a prime champion in Vladimir Klitschko.
Yeah.
And that
But
Anthony Joshua. Go on.
Yeah, sorry, there wasn't too much of a difference. I thought, I know maybe the Fury defeat maybe rocked Klitschko's career more to the point where he wasn't as good against Joshua, but I thought to get the finish that Joshua did and stuff like that, that tops it for me. But that's coming from a selfish AJ fan point of view as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would hesitate, but I would agree because for me, I thought that Vlad lost that fight with Fury before he even got in there. I think Tyson got under his skin with all the shenanigans before the fight. I think, she was talking about the ring size and everything else and the gloves and everything around that week. I think Klitschko just lost his head with it a little bit. Whereas the Joshua fight was almost like his revenge or his kind of chance at redemption, I felt. And I thought he came into that. And that's why we saw him be a little bit more reckless against AJ. Yeah. Because it was like a last chance saloon and he just threw everything at it. So
definitely.
There's definitely an argument there. So if he says he's only interested in these money fights now and he's not interested in facing Alexander Usyk and he's not interested in facing Anthony Joshua's and any of these upcoming prospects coming through the division, if you like, why is Tyson Fury still the WBC champion? Should he not be stripped?
Well, he 100% should be stripped. And as I kind of alluded to earlier, the job of a champion is to earn all the belts in the division or defend your one belt against the top contenders in the division. But he's doing neither.
No,
he's doing neither. And again, I go back to the whole argument when he argues that he's the best heavyweight of all time. When we go through them all, would Joe Frazier, would Lennox Lewis, Mike Tyson, would all of these in their prime, because he is at 34 years old as a heavyweight boxer, pretty much in his prime, would they have ever gone on a 3-fight streak of Dillian White, Derek Chisora 3, and Francis Ngannou? No, they're not in their prime.
No, it makes you wonder where Tyson's head is at, doesn't it? Because we both said on this call that we believe Tyson Fury probably beats Alexander Usyk, probably beats Anthony Joshua, probably beats any of the other names that you would list below that. So what's the problem, do you think? Why is he not taking these fights? Why is he not interested? Do you think, I mean, we've seen this before with Tyson where he's lost interest and walked away from the sport and he's faced his depression and other things mixed in amongst some, drug failings that were kind of swept under the carpet a little bit. But, why we're not seeing it?
Well, he claims he wants the money fights, but you're not going to get a much bigger money fight than Anthony Joshua. This is the thing. And so when I look at that, when he says he only wants the money fights, what he really means is he wants the easy money fights. He wants to keep that O intact. And would Ngannou sell more pay-per-views than Anthony Joshua?
Not a chance.
No. I can't
chance.
really see where that argument's coming into it.
No, I think when we talk about him being stripped of the belt, it's tricky because we've had this conversation just now and it sounds like, well, these two are hating on Tyson Fury. Yeah. I'm a massive Tyson Fury fan.
I am. He's one of my favourite boxers to watch in the ring.
And like you've said, the problem isn't the frustrating thing for Tyson Fury fans is that you want to see him go out and beat the other top competitors. You want to see him go there and then prove just how good he is. And that's what he's not doing. You're getting to watch him face B, C, D, E level opposition.
Yeah.
And none of the top guys.
And you never know what those contenders could do against him, as we've seen with Dubois against Usyk. All it was, that was inches away from Usyk losing all the titles and the Fury fight being off.
Yeah, I mean, even when you look at the Joshua loss to Ruiz, anything can happen. And it almost seems a little bit like even Tyson Fury knows that. And he's just not wanting to take that risk. So I'll go and fight an MMA fighter that's never had a boxing fight in his life. Now we know the threats that Francis Ngannou brings to the table. He is a heavy hitter, but he's a heavy hitter in 4-ounce gloves with a much clearer guard against guys that can't necessarily defend as well as a traditional boxer like Tyson Fury. So I think we all know what's going to happen with that fight itself. For Tyson Fury following the money fights, I'm the same as you said earlier on. I've got no issue with it. If he wants to fight Francis Ngannou, if he wants to do a rematch in a cage, which he never will, if he wants to go and fight John Jones, which he never will, by all means, crack on. But he needs to give that belt up and allow the division to move on. And
stop claiming the best heavyweight of all time, because you just can't claim it with that resume. You've got a resume that is just better than Anthony Joshua's, who you and your team slag off constantly. So that it's a better resume, but it's not.
Do you think
miles ahead? Yeah, I think wins against Wilder, I would worry for Joshua going against Wilder. Personally.
I agree. I agree that in that context, but do we put Derek Chisora, Safiri, Otto Wallin? Do we put all those guys above Joe Parker? The guy, obviously, with the Klitschko one's in there again, but when we look at Joshua's resume, I would argue that he's faced a higher quantity of higher opposition. I would argue that maybe Tyson's standout wins against Vlad, we said earlier on, it wasn't as impressive as Anthony Joshua's performance, not necessarily timeline for timeline, but the performance in the ring on the night. The Deontay Wilder one, yes, okay, you can kind of give him one of those, but he's had three cracks at getting that third fight to go the way it did. And outside of that, you're looking at Dylan White, who just got knocked out by Povetkin and had to come back and get that one back first. I'm not so sure, but it's definitely an argument to have. I would argue that Anthony Joshua's resume stacks up better than Tyson Fury's. Maybe Tyson's key wins stack up better than Joshua's. But as a resume, I'm not so sure.
That may be a very good point, actually. Maybe the wins are better than the actual resume. Maybe we don't give... I know he knocked him out in the second round, but maybe we don't give him credit for performances against Tom Schwartz, people like that who came into it 24-0. It's difficult to know how good people like that are. I mean, he's gone on to win all of his fights since. But I guess from that point of view, maybe I rate Deontay Wilder higher than the average boxing fan, but that's just me. I think to beat him 3 times, but to beat him twice and draw against him once, I think that's, as an AJ fan, that's probably better than anything that AJ's done for me personally.
I think, like you said, I think the one point you made there that I probably agreed with the most was the fact that, Deontay Wilder is a monster. He's a heavy hitter. Like I said, his boxing skills aren't necessarily there. We've seen him lose numerous fights up till he doesn't. We've seen him down on the scorecards, or where he should have been down on the scorecards, and then pull an incredible knockout out of the bag. The impressive thing with Tyson Fury for me is to go into 3 fights with Wilder and not get knocked out was extremely impressive. We could debate that first one, couldn't we, as well, for the time. But talking about fights that don't happen in boxing, let's move on from Tyson Fury and let's talk about Anthony Joshua and Deontay Wilder. What's your thoughts, A, on that fight? You just alluded to it a little bit there. But B, is it ever going to happen?
Yeah, well, I read the recent news. I think this is up to date that, Matchroom CEO Frank Smith and Eddie Hearn have come out and said the personal terms are agreed between the two, but they're just having problems with that Saudi Arabian promotion. I forgot the name. Is it Skill Challenge?
So it's changed. So Skill Challenge is the organisation that Eddie sorted out the Joshua Ruiz rematch with, and who they've had dealings with in the past. But basically, Skills Challenge have to apply for a budget from some Saudi prince or something, I don't know all the details, to be able to get that money to be able to put the fight on. Now, what's basically happened is there's been a little bit of a change and a little bit of a swift movement in that respect, where the Saudi prince that owns all the money in the sports and all the rest of it over there has basically said he'll only deal with Frank Warren. So the Skills Challenge and Matchroom Boxing relationship is great, but that's not the relationship that Eddie needs now to be able to put that fight on in Saudi. So you're right with what you were saying. They said that they'd agreed personal terms. I've also seen today that they were looking at moving the fight to Las Vegas. I've heard him talk about potentially doing it at Wembley. But what do we think? Because the personal terms were agreed because they were looking at large sums of money from individual deals with the Saudis. That's what they were basing it on. So if we're going back to Vegas or we're going to Wembley, that's not going to be the case. We're going to be talking about splits. And this was the problem making the fight in the first place. So do we see this fight?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a bit different from Fury Usyk, because I do genuinely believe that both fighters want the fight. There's a question that we may have to ask ourselves in a minute: is AJ ready for it? How you've alluded to it just there before. How good is Wilder in terms of his all-round boxing ability?
Yeah.
It's a close fight. It's a difficult fight to call, but at the minute, if it does happen, I think Wilder might be a slightly more difficult matchup than Fury or even Usyk might have been for Joshua. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, before we kind of talk about the actual fight, I mean, when we talk about making the fight first, do you think that a 50-50 split at this stage of their careers, they've both lost the world titles, they've both beaten Robert Helenius as their last opponent, do you think 50-50 is a fair split for this fight now? Because there was an argument previously that Anthony Joshua was a much bigger draw. Therefore, he maybe edged in regards to, what he brought to the table in comparison. But for me now, I think this is a 50-50. And it should, on that basis, be quite an easy fight to make.
Yeah, I agree. I think there was obviously difficulties back in 2018, 2019 when they first tried to organise this fight, and Wilder was forced to move on to Fury. I don't know if any problems there have carried over where they're demanding similar things, or maybe that 50-50 for me should be no problem at all. I mean, there's the argument of the location, whether it is at Wembley or in Las Vegas. Maybe you argue based on home country, they may get another certain percentage. I'm not too sure, but yeah, 50-50 for me shouldn't be a problem.
Yeah, I suppose the argument comes into if you do it in Las Vegas, you've got the pay-per-view money coming in. Whereas if you're at Wembley, you're relying mainly on gate sales. So obviously there's the pay-per-view drive just with the American timeline, it kind of moves that a little bit. But
yeah,
I mean, we talk about the fight itself. For me, I would agree. I think, again, I would have pegged Anthony Joshua to beat Deontay Wilder back when Joshua was before or after the Klitschko fight, if I'm completely honest, because that's where it all changed for me. I think you've got an Anthony Joshua up until and during the Vladimir Klitschko fight, and I think you've got a much more reserved, concerned, trying to be boxer style after the Klitschko fight, probably because of the hell he had to go through in that fight to get his hand raised. So this version, for me, Tyson Fury couldn't stay away from Deontay Wilder for 12 rounds without getting hurt. I can't see Anthony Joshua being able to stay away for 12 rounds without getting hurt. The only thing I would say is that this may be the kind of fight that Joshua needs to kind of pull him out of this boxer tirade, because I think Joshua carries the power to knock Wilder out without a shadow of doubt. And we all know Wilder's got the power to knock Joshua out. I think that it's very much a who lands first, but I also think I would have given the boxing edge to Anthony Joshua. But this kind of reserved style now concerns me massively for that fight, because if he tries to stay on the back foot, set the shot up, Wilder will catch him with something, and I don't think AJ will recover.
No, I think I saw somebody on Twitter make the argument of, well, Fury's been dropped more times in his career than AJ, but AJ's not faced Wilder. 3 of Fury's knockdowns against him in his career that he's conceded have been against Wilder, and that, if he connects, you see the Helenius fights. One knocked him out in 7 rounds, one knocked him out in a couple of minutes.
There's a different feel.
I remember.
We looked at Wilder then as well. I mean, when he landed that shot, he was on the back foot. He wasn't stepping into the shot and on the attack like Joshua was. Joshua set that up well, all credit, knocked him out cold. But the Wilder one was one of those where you look at it and you think that he shouldn't have been able to generate that much power from that position to put him down in the way that he did. but he does, because he just carries that natural power. So we talked about why the fight's not happening. We talked about, will we ever see it? Is AJ ready for it? It should, for me, be a simpler fight to make. But we're talking about Tyson Fury not fighting Alexander Usyk. We're talking about the Anthony Joshua, Deontay Wilder fight falling off. As far as boxing goes, we obviously converse with boxing and MMA fans, communities, and the difference between the two sports, especially when we compare the UFC to the kind of the top tier of boxing, we don't get the best versus the best enough, do we? And that's why the fights like Tank and Garcia and Spence and Crawford are such highlight moments, because we're just not used to it.
Yeah, I think the thing about that is when they do come about, they're amazing. They're spectacles that maybe we get a bit too used to as MMA fans. We get used to seeing the big fight, and so when these things do come around, the Crawford Spencers of the world, it's a spectacle. It gets that many pay-per-views, and I think, again, looking back on women's boxing for me, is that they keep on arguing that women's boxing doesn't have the depth throughout the divisions that men's does. But if none of the depth is fighting each other in the men's boxing, then does it matter what the depth is?
No.
So I can't stand heavyweight boxing at the minute.
No.
Just to truth be told, because I'm just not. That's why I'm so excited for Zhang Joyce again, because at least it's two great heavyweights fighting for once.
Yeah, and I think, like you said, that's the frustrating thing, because when boxing's done right, it's the best sport in the world. When the best face the best, and we get those big fights, it can be incredible, but we just don't see it enough. And when we talk about the UFC, for example, we talk about rankings, and more often than not, you get the number one contender faces a champion, and the rankings move around depending on the latest victories. But normally, despite certain occasions when there might be a need for something else, the number one contender normally fights the champion. So if we get an interim champion, he fights the champion in his next fight once the champion returns from an injury or something like that, a layoff. But obviously in boxing, we've got, we talk 4 belts. You could argue there's 5. We talk Ring Magazine, we talk IBF, WBC, WBA, WBO, and anyone from the MMA world goes, so who's the champion? And you say, well, he's a champion, and he's a champion, and he's a champion. Well, yeah, but who's the best? Well, we don't know, because none of them will never fight each other.
Do you think Sorry, can't get it out. Do you think that means that we should be more thankful for people like Canelo, who do the undisputed throughout?
Oh God, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's set a bit of a trend, and I do think we'll see it a little bit more, because I think when you look at Tank and Garcia, for example, I mean, the reports were, what was it, 1.2 million or something like that, pay-per-view buys, that was being reported. I mean, that's big money for those two guys. And we're talking about two guys that weren't the champion of the weight class. You know what I mean? So we're in a position where we're not seeing enough fights at heavyweight, but across the board, we're starting to see a few more, and hopefully that will set a trend for what's coming next. So we are going to take a quick break. When we come back from the break, we will be discussing the fiasco that surrounds Conor Benn and his potentially upcoming fights with Chris Eubank Jr. So we'll catch you all in a moment.
And you're watching Combat Sports UK.
Hello and welcome back to the Combat Sports UK Boxing Podcast. If you were with us just before the break there, then we will be reviewing Chris Eubank Jr. versus Conor Benn and the potential of that being next. What's your thoughts, mate? Don't hold back.
Well, the situation was just a shit show, wasn't it? Let's be frank about it. Last year was awful. Maybe looking at it from a brighter side, we got the Liam Smith Jura fights against Eubank, which amazing, probably 2 of the best UK fights this decade so far. But I'll be glad to see it finally happen. Whether it's a deserved fight for Conor Benn after what's happened, that's debatable, and we'll probably go on to debate it. But I've heard some news from it as well from TalkSport and Eddie Hearn that it might happen before the end of the year or the start of next year. So looking forward to it if it does happen. What about you, mate?
See, we're going to have to keep this short, because the way I could go off about this, we could be here all night. For me, Conor Benn shouldn't fight, full stop. there's no line drawn, no nothing. He's not proven anything of any innocence whatsoever, despite what you read in news articles or his promoters say or he says. Conor Benn's not innocent, and I like Conor Benn, or liked Conor Benn. I think the way he's behaved throughout this whole situation is his career's been a PR shit show. So I think it's a Conor Benn the fighter. I mean, when we talked about Conor Benn going up against Chris Eubank Jr., Conor Benn was the hero and Chris Eubank Jr. was the villain. And if this fight does happen, that's going to completely switch. Without a shadow of doubt, everybody's going to want to see Conor Benn get knocked spark out, because people need to face up to the things that they've done, whether it was intentional, unintentional. And the problem with this is we've got no clarity. All we've got is a failed test. Or 2 failed tests.
2 fair, yeah.
We've got 2 failed tests here. And we've got a situation where we've got Conor Benn, who was tested positive for a banned substance. The B samples come back positive for that same substance. He's been told then that he can't fight. The British Boxing Board of Control condemned the fight against Chris Eubank Jr., forcing the fight to fall off. They've then, Conor Benn's license to fight with the British Boxing Board of Control expired, and that hasn't been renewed. So he cannot fight in the UK under a British license. He would have to get a license from elsewhere. He could still fight in the UK, but Eddie Hearn has publicly said that he doesn't want him to do that. He wants his career to continue and him to clear his name fully. Now, we're led to believe that the suspension has now ended, the temporary suspension of Conor Benn, because there has been no ban inflicted. We've just had a temporary suspension pending investigation. Now, what we've had is a problem where we've got a fighter who's failed a drugs test that isn't being prosecuted for that failed test. He's not received any punishment. He would argue that he's been out of the ring for X amount of time now, and it's a loss of earnings and it's X, Y, and Z. But the reality of the situation is he failed the test. He's not allowed to step back in there until that's proven innocent, or a ban should be given. And I don't completely blame Conor Benn. For me, the testing procedure stinks. The fact that there's nobody to inflict any punishments, really, like everyone's turning to, oh, what do you think we should do? Well, what do you think we should do? No one wants to take any responsibility and actually put that ban in place. The reality of the situation is, if Conor Benn had tested positive for that substance, that fight would have been called off and he'd have been given a 2-year or a 3-year ban. We'd be halfway through for it. You know what I mean? We'd be coming up to a point when Conor Benn was talking about, getting back in the ring, booking a fight. Now it doesn't feel right to do that, because even if he was to return, you're kind of thinking, well, all right, he's not been able to fight in the ring, but has he really been banned? Has he really served his sentence? It's just the procedure itself is an absolute mess.
Yeah, well, you've alluded to it there, but you haven't said the exact words. Is strict liability is meant to be taken? This is meant to be put onto the boxer. It doesn't matter how it got into his system. The whole point of strict liability is that it's in your system. Clomiphene, the substance which you tested positive for, I read somewhere that it's a substance that could, double your testosterone levels. Now, take that into account, and then take Chris Eubank Jr. cutting that much weight into account.
Yep.
And the people I'm most angry about with that whole first fight last year is the promoters. They were still going to go ahead with it if that document hadn't come out, if that hadn't been leaked to the press. And you've got to be so careful. But you see boxing deaths happen every year, and I no wonder Chris Eubank Jr. Chris Eubank Sr. was so publicly against the fight happening, because you never know what could happen when you've got those testosterone levels against a weakened fighter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and we've got Eubank Sr. there, obviously a bit in around the Michael Watson situation as well. So Chris Eubank Sr. knows exactly what it's like to see a boxer go through something, that's irreparable, let's say, a damage that you never kind of come back from. So we've got a situation, like I said, where we've got a boxer that's failed a test. And this boxer has proclaimed his innocence. You've talked about strict liability there. Now, just touching on the drugs thing, my understanding is that the substance that he actually tested positive for is almost a hiding agent. That's my understanding of it, is that it's a female fertility drug that lowers or heightens estrogen levels or whatever else, which basically, if you were doing a cycle of steroids, it would mask that. That's kind of the intention. So we're talking about a fighter here that, I mean, we look at the excuses and we've heard the egg excuse, and we'll come on to that talking about the WBC in a bit. But we've got a situation where this fighter's failed a test. Now we're looking at him going back in, and now he's saying, well, I'll go and fight at 160. I'll go and fight him at 168. I don't really care. Yeah. It sounds desperate because obviously that wasn't the plan initially. It just seems like whatever it's going to take to get Conor Benn back in there, he's willing to do, the promoters are willing to do, and it's kind of, well, bollocks to the failed test. It's kind of irrelevant. No one's done anything about it, so we'll just crack on. And it's a shit show. I mean, like I said, I don't like to keep making MMA comparisons, but we look at USADA with the UFC and we get, okay, I'm not saying that's always been a clean process, but more often than not, we have a fighter test positive, a ban is inflicted, and then we
ramifications are clear.
Yeah. So you kind of face up and you go, okay, well, this fighter's failed the test, is a service punishment, and now he's back. You know, okay, there's got to be a line on that. There's certain things which don't sit too well with me, but, you know, the reality is we've had a punishment there, and with this, we just don't have any kind of punishment. So from a morality point of view, should this fight go ahead until Conor Benn has been either proven innocent or has served out a significant ban?
It's a difficult one. I think maybe, I don't know. For me, it's such a difficult situation. This is a conversation which is bigger than boxing, bigger than sport in general, where there's the whole argument of innocent until proven guilty. But we know with the processes behind the scenes and the corruption in places like boxing, you just never know the true story. Conor Benn and maybe one or two others in his team are the only ones who are going to know definitively what happened and what he's taken. And you know, in a dream situation, we give Conor Benn comes out innocent and we can all move on from it. But for me, it's not no. And even if he was to have a tune-up fight, I would be worried for whoever he was facing in a tune-up fight. Yeah,
of course, yeah. It's not about the opponent that's across from him. It's not, you know, a sympathy vote for Benn Eubank Jr. It's a situation saying Conor Benn shouldn't fight until he's cleared. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned there innocent until proven guilty. I would argue that you switch that because he's been proven guilty. He's failed 2 tests. So, you know, when they're talking about contamination of X, Y, and Z and these tests as well, you can't contaminate 2 individual tests in the same way. Oh, you can, but you know what I mean? The chance of that happening is slim to none, let's be honest. So I don't see an argument there. I think Conor Benn is is guilty until he proves that he's innocent. And he's not been able to do that. I mean, we talk about this 3,000-word document that he's put together, you know, that he sent over to the WBC that none of us have seen. None of us have read. It's not been made aware, you know, sent out to the public. And why? Is it because, you know, from a legal standpoint, they can't do that? Or is it because it's utter bollocks and it's been deemed as being utter bollocks and they've been told if they release it, then the public are going to think it's utter bollocks? Yeah. Do you know what I mean?
I mean, it's the nicest way possible. I can't imagine Conor Benn writing a 3,000-word document and it coming out perfectly worded and completely in his fate. But
it'd be done by some lawyers, and it could have probably been summed up in 150 words. But that's what these people do. They bullshit.
They might have used all that language. It might be a 3,000-word document, as I say, that could have been completed in 150 words to bore the pants off of everybody, and you don't know what to believe. But
So, what I want to talk about an organisation, and MMA fans won't necessarily understand too much about this, but you know, we have the WBC, the WBO, the WBA, and the IBF, and we'll just stick at them. We're not involved in any IBOs or any of these other bollocks. We'll just talk strictly about the top 4, if you like. And one I want to focus on is the WBC, because when we talk about corruption in boxing and what a mess it's in and X, Y, and Z, these guys are my favourites. Because, you know, we've got the Riyadh belt, the WBC Riyadh belt that will be available for Tyson Fury or Francis Ngannou should he win. We've got all these different bullshit belts coming along the lines. You know, we're fighting for this belt, we're doing this, we're going to put our name on this, we're going to do this. We're not going to strip Tyson Fury even though he won't defend his belt. We're not going to strip the Charlos from not defending the belt. I say the Charlos, I obviously mean Jamal. But that's just organisations as a whole. The WBC, for me, though, there's a couple of points I wanted to talk about here. Number one, we'll carry on with the Conor Benn situation, because if anybody's been following the situation with this case, Conor Benn was given a way out by the WBC. He was asked to provide details and documentation of his diet to the WBC, who then confirmed that he tested positive from the supplement that was found because it came through contaminated eggs and he'd been eating too many.
Yep.
Why is a sanctioning body of the sport of boxing that's right at the top of the game and is responsible for putting all these top fights on that we see across world boxing, why are they offering Conor Benn a way out of a situation? It should be for him to prove to them why he's innocent. Why are they doing it the opposite way around?
It's the reasoning as well. I mean, even Conor Benn's kind of come out and alluded to this hasn't helped me at all. This is, if anything, it's made it look worse. And
Conor Benn said he doesn't agree with it, hasn't he? That it's not true, and that's not the reason.
He doesn't agree. It could, not the reason, and also, what the hell has that done for his image? Like everybody's just the memes online, the jokes online. That I mean, even top boxers, Chris Eubank as well, has obviously taken the mick out of it, and it's like. The WBC, I mean, all you got to do is look at the person at the top, Maurizio Sullivan, and you can very quickly figure out how that company's going to be run.
Yeah, I mean, for boxing fans, they already know this and will already understand it. But for the MMA fans that may tune into this podcast as well, because obviously, a lot of our fan base is MMA orientated. The sanctioning bodies take a cut from the fighters. And when they put a belt on the line, even more than likely this Tyson Fury versus Francis Ngannou WBC Riyadh belt, there'll be a 3% sanctioning fee attached to that from the total purse for the fight. And it's the same thing for Conor Benn. And Conor Benn, whether you like it or not, sells. He makes money. He's in big fights. His fight with Chris Eubank Jr. will probably do exceptionally well. Maybe not on a global scale, but just particularly in the UK. And the WBC would probably like to stick some kind of shit belt on there and claim a 3% margin from it. So
it'll be named something stupid after their dad's, like a father's legacy.
The WBC egg like belt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it'll be a stupid name. It will be a belt that means absolutely nothing, but they need to get a bit of silverware in the photos at the end of the fight.
Yeah. So carrying on with the WBC, we've obviously talked about Fury. We've talked about Conor Benn. The last one I wanted to touch on was the Amanda Serrano situation. So for those that don't know, Amanda Serrano has got a fight coming up. And for the first time, she will become, well, not the first time, but the first time in women's boxing, if you like, she will be competing in a 12 by 3-minute fight. Now, when this was announced, everybody thought, oh, brilliant. 12 3-minute rounds for women, just the same as the men do. Instead of the 10-2s, this is a big step forward. This is a big thing. It's amazing. It's this, that, and whatever else, especially in a championship fight.
Yep.
And then we had Mauricio Sullivan, your mate, come out and basically say that women could not fight for 12 3-minute rounds and that they weren't going to sanction it for the title because he didn't believe it was safe for the fighters. What's your take on that?
It's just... It's just backwards. It's even if you don't agree with it, what's the harm in sampling it? What's the harm in if you believe that genuinely, well, let them prove it. If they if the fight gasses out and goes really slow after 6 rounds, you've got some evidence. But to just slag off an entire sport in itself in women's boxing for the over a hypothetical, if you like, is ridiculous. Let it happen.
Well, I think you touched on it earlier on as well. When we look at last year in particular, all the best fights in boxing were in the women's divisions. And when we're talking about 3-minute rounds, and this is going to sound very Fight Disciples-esque, but when we talk about 3-minute rounds, we're not talking about every fight in women's boxing. But we are talking about Katie Taylor and Chantel Cameron. We're talking about Clarissa Shields. We're talking about Amanda Serrano. We're talking about Michaela Mayer and Alicia Baumgardner when she gets back from her drugs ban that seems to be just rifling its way
Swept
through
under the
boxing. Yeah. But, when we're talking about the top tier of boxing, we're not talking about, rookies and amateurs, because the depth isn't there in the women's division. We touched on that earlier. But for these top fighters, I mean, we've watched Katie Taylor, for example, and I'm a massive Katie Taylor fan. But we've seen Katie Taylor in fights where if there was another minute in that round, she might have struggled to come out of some of those fights. And we've also seen the likes of Amanda Serrano, for example, applying pressure like crazy. Your Savannah Marshalls as well, those kind of fighters, they're really putting on the pressure, and it's difficult to get someone out of there in 2 minutes. If you've got an extra minute, that's a long time to have to try and survive in the round. And even if we did 10 threes, it would be better than the 2-round fights. I'd be all up for that. I just think that women's boxing misses out because we don't. What's the highlight? What do you want to see? You turn into Twitter or Instagram or anything in the morning following a fight and that you've not watched, you're looking for a 3, 4, 5 second highlight reel. And that's what boxing in the women's division is missing, because 2-minute rounds don't allow that. And I just touched on the fight disciples, and they were having a conversation about Clarissa Shields, for example, who you could argue was the pound for pound number one in women's boxing, the greatest women's boxer that we've got. Yeah. But years down the line, when the sport moves on and these, Sullivan and all the rest of them move on, and we do get 3-minute rounds, then the comparison between now and back in the day, those comparisons will be made. When we've seen it over the years when you talk about your Ali's and your Frasers and all these guys, your Sonny Listons, and then you look back at Rocky Marciano's, for example, and you say, well, it was different then. He's got this great record, but there wasn't really anyone around. You know what I mean? Then you're looking at the modern day heavyweights with the science and all the rest of it, and you're looking at Tyson Fury at 6'9" and saying, well, could your Mike Tyson's, for example, who struggled with the taller fighters, who was only, a small heavyweight, could he deal with that kind of, new athlete, if you like? And it's a conversation that goes on as long as time, but I just feel like the 2-minute rounds are taken away from women's boxing at the minute. And the fact that the WBC haven't sanctioned this fight, I think, is just disgusting. And just to top that off, the last thing I will say on it is Maurizio Sullivan compared it to tennis. Did you see that?
I didn't actually see. No, I didn't see him compared to tennis.
He basically said that women in tennis only compete for 3 sets, whereas the men compete for 5. And the reason for that is because the women aren't as physically capable as the men.
But it's your own sport, But
we follow the sport of MMA.
Yeah.
We watch the PFL. We watch all these different ones there. We watch the UFC. There's women all over the world fighting in main events, 5-minute rounds, exactly the same as the men. We've got main event fights happening, 5 3-minute rounds, just the same as the men. We've got fights across the board. We've got stars in MMA. We've got, the Amanda Nunes's. We've had the Chris Cyborgs in the past. We've got your Valentina Shevchenko's and Zhang Weili and everybody else that's coming, going to be coming through after this. And they fight all the same as the men. And this is combat sports. No pun intended.
As you say, as you make the point in the future, you don't want there to be an asterisk over these great women's performances. You don't want there to be any argument to say, well, it wasn't this, it wasn't that. And I've been lucky enough to, talking about like a bit lower down, not from the title fight, so I've been lucky enough to see Caroline Dubois fight twice. And there's been times, even in the first round, where if that first round had gone on for 10 seconds longer, she'd have got a opponent out, let alone another minute. So it, how much better does a first round knockout look than a second round knockout? I don't know. But as you say, the main point about this is you don't want there to be any excuses from the backwards people in society that they haven't done it over 3 minutes.
I mean, you think about explaining it to somebody and saying, which one of these fighters do you think is the best? The first thing they're going to do is go into a box rec or a Wikipedia page or something like that. And as they scroll down, they'll go first round. Oh, they didn't get them out till the 4th.
Yeah.
But because it was 2-minute rounds back then. You know what I mean? But I just think the whole thing with the WBC just not even allowing this to go ahead stinks for the championship. the fact that Amanda Serrano has basically said, "Well, fuck you then. We're gonna do it anyway." And I never thought I'd be crediting Jake
signed to
Paul.
the PFL as well.
Yeah, I never thought I'd be crediting Jake Paul for anything. But obviously, MVP Promotions are putting that fight on, which is his organisation, and he's obviously the manager of Amanda Serrano. But for Serrano to just kind of go, "Well, I want to do this, so I'm doing it anyway," should be belt. In essence, she's done it very respectfully, but you know, if you check her Twitter page out, for example, she's definitely not too happy about it. She wanted this to be a marquee name, and then you see Chantel Cameron coming out and saying, "Well, I'm game for 3-minute rounds in my rematch with Katie Taylor," and you think, "Well,
I'm sure they all would be."
Well, I know when they've spoken to Clarissa Shields in the past, for example, and she said, "I'd be open to 3-minute rounds. I just want paying for it.
Yeah,
I'm not doing longer in the ring." And not getting paid any extra for it. And that's where the problem lies in the grand scheme of it for promoters and whatnot. And I'd personally like to see Eddie Hearn and Matchroom Boxing take a real stand on this, because Eddie's obviously pushed women's boxing probably more than any other promoter. So for him to do something like this over 3-minute rounds would make a massive difference.
I think Ben Shalom at Boxer as well, they do a really great job with their women's boxing. And I think...
They're all picking up now, obviously. Yeah,
they are all picking up. Yeah, I think it's time for, even looking at it from the point of view of it's evolution for the women and for their coaches in training camps. They've now got to prepare for and train their fighters for 3-minute rounds. It's a evolution in coaching sense as well. So again, as I said at the start, why Maurizio Suleiman can't even try it, can't even sample it to see what would happen. I can't get my head around it. But
no. So, I mean, we've obviously jumped onto this podcast, and when we were having chats beforehand, we were going to talk about upcoming fights. And the reality is, when we were talking about getting this podcast up and running, we said, well, it's going to be a little bit sporadic. We're going to do the MMA one on a weekly basis because we know where we stand. We get great fights continuously. All right, we have the odd fight night card, but even necessarily the biggest names, or not the biggest names, sorry, can come out with a real bang and put a hell of a fight night on. Some of these slip under the radar a little bit. But with boxing, it's a little bit quiet. Obviously, we've got Lopez defending his title this weekend. Probably the worst kept secret now after doing what he did to Michael Conlan. So that one's coming up. But we're not going to, on this podcast, we're not going to dive into fights unless we feel that they really deserve it. And probably the first one coming up that we're going to probably preview properly is going to be Joe Joyce and Zhang in the rematch, because there's plenty of talking points there. There's plenty of narratives for the winner, potentially. But when we're talking about bits of news that have come up, and that's kind of how we've chucked this together. I mean, when we talk about boxing and we talk about MMA, what's the biggest comparison or the biggest slight or positive, if there is one, that you would say is a difference from boxing over to MMA? Or vice
what
versa?
Boxing has over MMA?
Or vice versa, whichever way. Which one, what's something that out of the two sports that you would pick and say, I wish MMA did this better, or I wish boxing did this like such and such?
Well, I wish from the UFC's point of view, I wish the top MMA fighters got paid like the top boxers do from the UFC point of view. That would be my main point. I know it's a widely thought of point. It's nothing too controversial there.
No, well, that's why we see so many MMA fighters box, isn't it? And go over and do boxing because the money's there. Yeah,
and then from a boxing point of view, I guess the main one we've already established would be seeing those big fights more often. But I think a more cohesion between the different promotions and different organisations. That I know we in MMA we've only got about 4 or 5 big promotions, and they very rarely talk to each other. But when they do, it always seems to be on quite a classy basis and always done quite well. I mean, I just want to stop seeing Frank Warren and slagging everybody off on TalkSport every time I go onto YouTube, or seen Eddie Hearn fight Simon Jordan. It's just
I don't think TalkSport
it's
helped
WWE.
Anything, I think
no, not at all.
TalkSport are there just to cause a bit of shit and watch it all unravel in front of them. But yeah, I mean, for me, I was traditionally, and I don't know what your background was necessarily on it, but I've always been a boxing fan first. That's where I came into this, and I've gradually moved over and almost favoured the world of MMA. And the reason that I favoured it was because I couldn't believe how frequently good events and good fights were on. Like what we see a lot of the time in boxing is no fights for 3 or 4 weeks. And then we see 3 fights across 3 different organizations on at the same time of night, being promoted by somebody different, where you can't watch them all without getting 3 different devices out or hitting the record button on a couple of them. And then you've got nothing again for another 4 weeks. And that was the most frustrating thing for me. When you come over to MMA, you've got a fight night every week. There's always something out of those cards that you can pick and go, that's going to be a belter. Whether they're big names or not, you can't. Once you're in the sport and you understand the fighters and the ranking system and how everything works, you look at it, stylistic matches, but then you go, that's going to be an absolute barn burner. And it might be way down on the card. I think as well, the fact that a lot of these MMA events, and I'm talking specifically about, UFC London, Paris, the European ones, obviously the Australia was the last one that we just had. But the arena's been full pretty much from the get-go because everyone's in to watch the first fight, and then it remains full. Yeah, people still go to the bar and get a drink and go and do whatever, but everybody's there to watch all the fights, and that talks about the level, or not necessarily the level of the fighters, but for me, the matchups and the fact that a lot of the time fighters are well matched, and you can say, you're in for something special. And MMA fans are used to that, and we come in and we watch 10, 12, 15 fights, whatever it might be, and you're probably going to get 80% of them are going to be good fights, whether they go to points, whether you get a finish or not. In the world of boxing, you get a main event, a semi-decent co-main if you're lucky, and more often than not, a bag of shit underneath it. Where
what we'll give Eddie Hearn and Matchroom credit for is the Joshua and Helenius main card. I thought that was probably the best main card I've seen in quite a while.
Yeah, I think the problem with Matchroom cards for me is that a lot of the time the matchups aren't fair matchups. They're heavily favoured for the home fighter too often. You see a lot of the Matchroom fighters in there and you think, well, it's a knockover again, or sometimes it's a name. And then you look at it on card and you go, that's a good fight. But then you go, hang on a minute, he's lost his last 4. But, he's got a big name, so everyone knows who he is. And you think, you look at your Derek Chisora and Gerald Washington, for example. I mean, 2 old men matched up together. But as far as the matchmaking side goes, I had no problem with that because they're both well past it. They're both shot to bits. Yeah. Stick them on, it's fine. But
I'd rather see that than Tyson Fury beat the crap out of him for however many rounds.
Oh God, yeah, absolutely. But that's what I mean. It's fair matchmaking. But a big thing that we've been having discussions about this week in the world of MMA is rematches. And obviously in boxing we have rematch clauses coming out of our ears. It's very rare there's a main event that goes ahead, title or non-title, that doesn't have a rematch clause. We look at Joyce and Zhang coming up. We've talked about that a couple of times. It's got a rematch clause in that. That's the only reason it's happening, because the fight itself didn't warrant it. It was a one-sided beatdown. And, in the way that not a lot of us expected it to necessarily go. But we've just got a lot of that happening across the board. And we're talking about it in MMA with Izzy and, Sean Strickland. Should he get an immediate rematch? And my concern is that that's what's going to happen with MMA. When you listen to Dana and he's talking about, should this be a rematch? We should get an immediate rematch. And I think, no, we see that all the time in boxing. And that's what boxing fans hate. They don't like to see rematches between 2 fighters where they've already seen one comprehensively beat the other one. The Usyk Joshua fight never needed to happen. This Joe Joyce fight, it might go differently. It might, because I think Joe Joyce was a little bit off on that night. But I would still be favouring Zhang coming into that. And if he does beat Joe Joyce, it's been a complete waste of time and just held the division up again. We've got situations where you get Andy Ruiz come in and knock out Anthony Joshua. That deserves a rematch, because everyone goes, fucking hell, that was never meant to happen.
And Joshua knocked him down.
Yeah, and it was one of those where you thought, oh, right, okay. The Tyson Fury Wilder ones, great. For me, the third fight didn't need to happen. The second one was comprehensive enough, but I could understand it after the first one, because you've got the scorecards there where Fury's comfortably won the fight. You've got the knockdown at the end of the fight where he survives by the skin of his teeth in a 15-second count. So you've got, you know what I mean? There's a narrative, there's something there. We talked about it in MMA with Izzy and Pereira. You know, you've got a long reigning champion there who's been knocked out by a guy that's beaten him a bunch of times already. But the immediate rematch made sense because, you know, a champion that's been that dominant over that period of time deserves that. Now we're talking about it. And, you know, for me, the Strickland fight shouldn't happen again with Izzy.
Yeah, my thought process in terms of boxing would be that maybe there could be some sort of rule. I know it's very difficult to agree between all the different promotions and matchmakers, but where a fighter has to win a certain amount of rounds or complete a certain amount of knockdowns to earn themselves a rematch. That just be a stipulation. The loser must do this to get a rematch.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I don't think it needs to be overly complicated. I think, was it a close fight? If it was, most people would say, well, I wouldn't mind seeing it again. Was it a great fight? Well, if it was a great fight, no one's going to complain about seeing it again. I mean, if it's a fight that, like, if we look at the Lee Wood and the Mauricio Lara fight, for example, Lee Wood was winning that fight.
Yeah.
He was outboxing Mauricio Lara, and then bang, it's all over. So for me, that deserves it or warrants a rematch because you kind of go, well, he was winning that fight, he just got caught. Can he do something different? And we saw him come back and do that, you know, comprehensively outskilled Lara in the rematch and just, you know, was superb. So
is the argument against those flash knockouts that's part of the sport? You've almost got to deal with it, earn yourself a rematch. You can get knocked out at any point.
But I think the thing is as well, most in boxing would probably accept it. And this is the problem. We look at MMA again, and like I said, I hate to make the comparisons because it always sounds like I'm slagging boxing. But you look at Charles Oliveira, for example, was the champion, lost the belt, didn't get an immediate rematch, went out there, got a big win. Now he's back in for the title. You've looked at that happen a bunch of times, just one win. The situation there is different, though, because we are functioning under one organisation. We don't have mandatory challenges coming up that aren't. I mean, one of the things I'd put down for discussing today, which we're probably not going to get time to do, is the ranking system in boxing as well. You know, and the fact that you've got names in there that've got no right to be there. And you've got people like, for example, Anthony Joshua, who might be ranked with the WBA, but isn't ranked with the WBC at all, or he's number 10 in the rankings. He's not the number 10 heavyweight in the world, so he shouldn't be ranked number 10.
I look at the rankings before we came on today, and I saw Deontay Wilder first in one, and I don't think he's in another three. Maybe he's very low down, but I couldn't see it.
And that's the problem. Yeah.
Deontay Wilder's not a top 15 heavyweight in the world.
And that's the problem that we've got. I think you change the rankings, it makes everything a lot easier because you get a lot more top mandatory fights. But, you know, like when we talk about there, you've got Deontay Wilder. Most would concede that Deontay Wilder, whichever order you put them in, is a top 4 heavyweight in the world.
Yeah.
So how can he not be ranked at all in the top 15 of the remaining organisations? It's a joke. And
it's the politics of it, isn't it?
Yeah, and if we looked at the WBA, WBO, IBF, even if they ordered them all differently, if we had Joshua, Wilder, Ruiz, you know, those guys in there, Usyk, Fury, and they were all kind of in there amongst each other, then these fights would be happening more often. But they're not, and there's a reason they're not, and we all know what that is. It's all about this and making the most money off the biggest names. So I think that probably draws an end to that 1 hour bitching session that I in particular have just gone on. But like I said, the plan with the boxing pods moving forward is that we will pick something up if it warrants it. If there's news out there and there's subjects that we can talk about, we'll jump on. If there's big fights and good fights coming up, we will jump on and we will hit a record and we'll get a pod out to everybody. But we're not going to come on here and just talk about absolute rubbish unless that's what you think we've done today, in which case...
Not. And I also think we need to do a bit more than just the big fights. Otherwise, you'll get about 3 podcasts a year. So
yeah, that's it. Yeah, we'll definitely. When I say big fights, I mean big fights in relation to the world of boxing, not what we would expect from other sports. Yeah. So yeah, I think on that note, we'll knock this one on the head. We'll thank you all for listening in or watching. So just a quick reminder: you can find us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Spotify and Apple Pay. Search for Combat Sports UK. and you'll find us all there. We're constantly generating and putting out articles, talking about upcoming fights, breaking news stories. And like I said, we have an MMA pod. If you've not listened already because you're just a boxing fan, but you fancy getting stuck in, head over and give it a listen. And likewise, we will notify everybody on social media when the boxing pods are going to be coming up, where you can find them and when they'll be available. And on that note, Jared, I think we'll say goodbye. So thanks for jumping on, mate, and we'll catch up the next time.
Definitely, it's been great first experience. So I hope everybody looks forward to the next one.
Yep. And no doubt we'll bring more opinions that will upset a few people then. So we'll sign off at that. Thank you, everybody, and we will catch you next time.